Howard the Duck. I know. Some of you hear that and cringe and think, oh God, what an awful movie. And some of you hear that and you think, Howard the Duck. Yeah, I remember that movie, the one with the talking duck. Some of you hear that, maybe you think of the old Steve Gerber comics from the 1970s. Who didn't love those? And then some of you hear that and you think, Howard the Duck. Yeah, I loved him in Guardians of the Galaxy. But today we're going to talk about the film Howard the Duck and why I believe it holds up today and why I think it's criminally underrated. So without further ado, let's dive right in and talk about the first ever Marvel motion picture, the 1986 George Lucas production, Howard the Duck. Now, before we can start talking critically about Howard the Duck as a film, let me talk about my personal experience with Howard the Duck and why I've grown so fond of such a commonly hated film. Now, as far back as I can remember, Howard the Duck may be the first film I ever saw. And I loved that film so much. I remember we had a copy of it on VHS, and not a purchase copy either. This is one of those cases where my parents actually taped it from HBO. So every time I'd watch it, it also had that epic HBO feature presentation opening. And that alone just added to the epicness of this film that I was watching. As a kid, 2-3 years old I think I was at the time, seeing this talking duck interacting with this rock star woman and fighting this giant alien scorpion monster thing from outer space just blew my mind. And I loved that film so much that I would watch it all the way through to the end. And then I would rewind it back to the beginning and watch it again and again and again. And I would do this to the point where my mom would have to shut it off on me and put me to bed for the night. I remember we wore that tape out. I watched it so much, to the point where it wouldn't even play. I think the tape snapped. I had watched it so much. And one scene in particular, the scene at the end where Howard has his guitar solo, I loved that scene in particular so much that I used to have this plastic red shovel where I would wait until that scene would come on and I would hop up off the couch and I would imitate this scene here, Howard with the red guitar, and I'm jamming out with my little red shovel, and I memorized exactly how Howard moved on stage, every motion, every step he took, and I would copy it to the T. And then I would stop the film and I would rewind it back to the beginning and I'd sit down with my little red shovel and I'd wait for the scene to come back on. So it's hard for me to accept that when I later, as an adult, started to hear that my love and admiration for that film wasn't shared, it was a little hard for me to accept. Now, a lot of people were very, very critical of Howard the Duck. I remember sitcoms taking pot shots at Howard the Duck over and over again. The common analogy was, oh, this film is worse than Howard the Duck. Oh, this is just as bad as Howard the Duck. I started hearing that and thinking, does that mean it's awesome? Because I remember Howard the Duck as being amazing. So it was really, really hard for me to accept, especially as I started studying creative writing and as I myself became a writer and started looking at things more critically. I had a hard time reconciling my love, based mostly in nostalgia, for this film and how it was commonly regarded as not good.
Don't shed any tears over me, Toots!
You can wallow in your own self-pity!
Right. Well, who needs you? I don't need anybody.
Yeah, right.
So yes, I loved Howard the Duck, but I can admit the film has its problems.
What?
So I want to address those, or at least the common ones that I've heard growing up with this film. And one of my feelings towards this film and how it's so universally hated by critics is, I think the time that it came out, it was something that people just weren't ready for. I know it's kind of a bold statement to say that it was just maybe a little too ahead of its time, but I think that may be the case, and I'll explain to you why I think that is. So, at the time, no one had ever seen anything like that. Like I said, it was the first ever Marvel motion picture. And it was starring a talking duck man. Now, something to keep in mind with this is when George Lucas originally came up with the idea to do a Howard the Duck motion picture, he envisioned it as being an animated film. However, Universal didn't have a summer blockbuster for that summer. So they wanted George Lucas to give them a George Lucas live action summer blockbuster. So the film Howard the Duck went from being an animated film starring an animated duck person to being a live action film starring a live action duck person. I think for a lot of people at the time in the 80s, might have just been a little unsettling to see something like that.
You perverts!
Now let's stop there for a second because I really want to put this into perspective. Let's take another film starring a real life actor and an anthropomorphic character, Roger Rabbit. Now imagine that film without the animated Roger Rabbit, and instead it's got a puppet animatronic rabbit.
That's really disgusting.
Suddenly it changes things with that. You can kind of see where one film that's universally loved, like Roger Rabbit, could suddenly become a little weird and unnerving when you remove the fact that these are cartoon characters, and now we have to accept them as real life creatures. The other thing with it is that duck suit that they came up with was really good.
Well, sex appeal. Some guys got it, and some guys don't.
And I think it might have been too good, because if you watch that film today, even by today's standards, that duck suit is impressive. The way they were able to get all the range of emotion on that duck face with the eyes and the bill without CG, that was really a feat. And I think it was unsettling and unnerving to a lot of people at the time. So that's a common criticism I hear. And what I have to say to that is really just get the hell over it. Because now we're not in 1986, we're in 2018. And we have Marvel movies with talking raccoons and talking trees and Grimace disintegrating half the universe. So a talking duck person isn't really all that unnerving anymore. It's not anything crazy by today's standards. So I'm not saying that's the only criticism and that it invalidates everything else that people have to say about the film, but I do think that was something that it was up against in the 80s and why it made it really hard for critics to go into that movie and take it seriously. So That brings me to the next point. And the next criticism you hear very often when discussing Howard the Duck is a particular scene between Ed Gale, the man who was inside the duck suit, who also played Chucky, by the way, just throwing that out there, between Ed Gale and Leah Thompson. The infamous Howard and Beverly sex scene. Now, I want to first off say they didn't go all the way. They just tease it, but they do get dangerously close to that sex scene. And for a lot of people, that was really unsettling. If I were to tally all of the criticisms that I've heard of Howard the Duck in my life, and remember, I've been watching this film since I was 2 or 3 years old. I grew up defending this movie. The number one criticism I hear from most people is, oh my God, that movie where Leah Thompson had sex with the Duck Man? Oh, I can't believe that Leah Thompson had a sex scene with the Duck Man. That's the criticism that I hear a lot. Most often, definitely the number one criticism. And I get it. It's unsettling. It's weird and uncomfortable. But 2 points to that. One, the intent of the film, just as with the comics, was always to be absurd. It's an absurdist comedy, so that scene is understandably absurd. And then the other point, the more important point I want to make about people disliking Howard the Duck because Leah Thompson had a sex scene with a duck man, I want to remind you all of this. Now, if this lady can have sex with a fish man, and that movie can win an Oscar, then this lady can tease a sex scene with a duck man, and your argument is invalid. Now that we got those ridiculous criticisms out of the way, let's focus on the more legitimate criticisms. They do exist. I concede that. For example, the pacing. It's bad. Let me just run through the key points of Howard the Duck for you, and you'll see what I mean. First, Howard's on Duck World, establishing the ordinary world. He's in his living room, he's watching some TV, he's drinking a beer, reading some Play Duck, and all of a sudden, he's sucked through his apartment building, out into space, where he's dragged across the universe and down to Earth. Okay? That's the first 5 minutes. Then he lands in an alley in Cleveland, which I guess is him entering the dark world if we're sticking with the whole hero's journey thing. But then he's kidnapped by these 80s punks who try to use him as currency to get into a nightclub.
Yes, Frankenweenie, we finally found you again!
I think that's sex trafficking. He breaks away, then he has a run-in with the Satan Sluts biker gang, but then he has to rescue Beverly from these 2 drug addict criminal, I don't know, whatever this is.
I've been doing too much toot!
So then Beverly invites Howard back to her apartment where he spends the night, and then the next day, I guess, they go to a science museum where Beverly introduces Howard to Tim Robbins, who she thinks is a scientist, but really he's just a janitor.
Did you finish cleaning up the specimen lab?
So Howard gets really pissed off when he discovers that Tim Robbins is a janitor.
Listen, if you got blasted millions of miles through space, ended up on another planet, and were given an IQ test by a janitor, you'd be a little pissed off too.
So then Howard and Beverly have this big fight, and even though they've only been friends for like a day, they have this big emotional moment, like 2 friends are having this massive falling out. And then after only having been on Earth for a day, Howard decides he's going to give up on the plan of going back to Duck World, and he's just going to get a job. So then Howard gets a job at a sex club.
Towels, lotions, antibiotics.
I need that
But
creepy little
then he
dude in
hates
here.
that job,
Clean this
so he
place
quits
up.
his sex
How
club
am I
job.
supposed to run a class?
I quit!
And then he gets really depressed and scared when he realizes that human beings do really messed up stuff to ducks.
With duckaroni. But if every hunter can blast 15 of those from the sky.
So then he makes up with Beverly after he beats up her manager because, oh yeah, like a few scenes ago, she mentioned that her manager was stealing money from her.
I suggest you find a new manager.
Hey, I'd love to, but we got this damn contract with the sleazoid. He won't even give us the money he owes us.
So Howard beats him up and gets her money back, and then they become friends again. And then Tim Robbins comes back, but this time with Jeffrey Jones, and Jeffrey Jones is like, oh, that's weird that you're having sex with a duck.
This is not what you think. We're just very good friends.
Okay, so then Tim Robbins and Jeffrey Jones are like, we've been working on this big laser thing, and that's what brought you down to Earth. So if we just reverse the big laser thing, it'll send you back to Duck World. Okay, so then Beverly gets really sad because Howard's now going to be leaving, and Howard's like,
Right now, you're the one and only thing that's making it very hard for me to leave.
which doesn't make any sense because they just made up and they've only been friends for like whatever. So then they make it to the big laser thing, but oh no, it can't send Howard back to Duck World because there's been this big explosion and now the FBI's there. And then Howard's naked and he has to escape, so he throws a police officer into a garbage can. And then Howard and Beverly, they rediscover Jeffrey Jones, who's now acting really strange.
Guys, you need help.
So the three of them escape together and they go to this Cajun sushi diner. Do those exist? And then Jeffrey Jones reveals that he's now possessed by
one of the dark overlords of the universe.
Dark Overlord of the Universe?
That must be quite a responsibility.
So the Dark Overlord, he blows up the diner and then he kidnaps Beverly, and everything that happens from that point on is the actual superhero portion of the movie. And I think that latter 45 minutes of the film is what the movie always intended itself to be. But somewhere along the way, these two completely different plot lines for two totally different movies got fused together. And that's how we ended up with this weird, crazy, unfocused, goalpost shifting plot that is the Howard the Duck storyline. So yes, I concede that the plot is horribly unfocused and the pacing is atrocious, but I think I can shed some light on why that is. Let me read you this quote from Gloria Katz, one of the creators of the film. And she says, "We didn't really want to explain how Howard ended up on Earth, but with everybody in the movie business being very literal, you have to start from Duck World, explain what happened to Howard, then, well, we were sort of resistant to that, but we had no choice." So you see what she's saying there is they didn't want to do an origin story for Howard the Duck. They wanted to make a film where Howard had already been living on Earth. It was the studio who stepped in and told them they needed to add that origin story. But they already had a script. So now they had to take this origin story plotline and add it to their already existing script. And that's how we ended up with this story that felt like two completely separate plot lines forcibly fused together. Now, if you factor all that in and you just assume that Howard had been living on Earth this whole time, a lot of those other scenes start to make more sense. For example, Howard and Beverly having their big fight. That scene has more weight to it and makes a lot more sense when you assume that Howard's been on Earth for a while and that these two have been friends this whole time. Same goes for when Howard's leaving Earth and they have the emotional moment of saying goodbye to one another. That scene has more weight and that scene makes more sense when we assume that these two have been friends for a while and they didn't just meet a day ago. Same goes for Howard working in the sex club. It makes a lot more sense that Howard would get fed up with this job and quit if we assume that Howard's been working at this job for a long time. Or even that Howard's been struggling to find work because he has to take jobs at these skeevy locations that are willing to hire a little duck person. And the film would have worked a lot better if they could have just focused on that main plot line and didn't have to spend the first half of the movie focusing on this new origin story plotline. Now, regardless how you feel about the film, you can't argue that it fails due to a lack of effort. Watching it objectively, it's obvious that there was a lot of passion that went into the making of Howard the Duck, and that's where its strength lies. Despite the claims of some soulless, black-hearted demons on the internet, there's not a single dull moment in that film. I think that's where the rift exists between the fans who love Howard the Duck and the critics who hate it. I'm able to look past the film's flaws because what's good about it, its core, is so good that it outweighs all of those flaws. That's my argument. I'm not saying the flaws don't exist. I'm saying that a film can have an unfocused plot and a wonky storyline, and we can look past that as long as the things that are good about it are really good. For example, the first Avengers movie. I could make a whole video tearing that film down for its wonky storyline and its unfocused plot.
Enough! I am a god, you dull creature!
But I wouldn't do that because what's good about that film is its character work. Seeing the Avengers all come together for the first time and how they interact with one another and build relationships, that's what makes that film good. So I'm easily able to look past the fact that the third act is early 2000s superhero movie garbage, or that the Chitauri are just useless ammo fodder, or that Thor was easily able to deal with Loki alone in his solo film, so why does he need the help of the Avengers now, even if he has the glowing blue space cube? None of that matters, because what's good about the film is that we get to see Hulk and Thor fighting with one another about who's the strongest Avenger, and seeing Cap and Tony bickering like an old married couple. So you see, we're able to look past the problems of such an obviously flawed film because there's something else about it that makes it really good. As a fan of Howard the Duck, let me tell you what makes that film good. It's character work. You see, the core of the Howard the Duck comics is the relationship between Howard and Beverly. That's also true of the movie. Even though it doesn't make sense that those two are as close as they are, the actors really sell the chemistry between Howard and Beverly, so their strong friendship is apparent and makes their scenes together work, even if the story that got us there doesn't make sense. In scenes where they're laughing and joking with one another, it feels like we're watching a moment shared between two best friends. When they have their fight, the tension is real. And when they say their goodbyes, it's emotional because it feels like two longtime friends who've been through a lot together saying their final farewells. Now, a lot of that is actually the result of Leah Thompson's performance. Even the harshest critics tend to agree that Leah Thompson's actually really excellent in her performance as Beverly. However, the consensus among critics seems to be that she is the exception, not the norm. Their opinion toward the rest of the cast is that their performances are hokey and downright atrocious. Now, before we get into that, I just want to remind you that Howard the Duck was originally written to have an entirely animated cast. So when you're watching Howard the Duck, you are essentially watching a live-action animated film. Now, I point that out so I can address the criticism of Tim Robbins' performance as Phil Blumberg. Now, keeping in mind that he's playing an animated character in a live-action film, he actually nails it.
No, don't shoot! I'm an innocent hostage! The duck's a lunatic! What? He's a duck terrorist! He hijacked the plane!
Phil Blumberg is intended to be an excessively animated, over-the-top nincompoop, and that is exactly what Tim Robbins delivers.
Welcome back, Philzy! Thanks! It's great to be back, Howard!
That's one of the areas where critics are entirely missing the point. The absurdity of things like that. Jeffrey Jones's performance, Tim Robbins' performance. That's the charm of the film. And yes, maybe in an alternate universe where Jeffrey Jones just did the voice of a dark overlord possessed Dr. Jennings, maybe it would have been better. But I actually believe that his performance, coupled with the excellent practical effects makeup that they do on him, is one of the film's many strengths, not its flaws. It's like watching Pee-wee's Big Adventure if you can't stand Pee-wee Herman. Tim Burton's cinematography, the stop motion animation, the practical effects, the hokey acting, all of that is going to seem like shit if the charm at the core of the film ain't working for it. And the special effects in Howard the Duck are actually one of its biggest strengths. Sure, they're dated today, but for the time they were groundbreaking. We already talked about the practical effects makeup that they do on Jeffrey Jones and how excellent it shows his transformation into the Dark Overlord of the universe. But also, the stop motion animation and the miniature use that they use on the Dark Overlord of the universe are still some of the best in cinema today. Unfortunately, it's always difficult to make a film where the main character is a special effect. There were a lot of those in the 80s. Howard the Duck, Short Circuit, Harry and the Hendersons, E.T. And actually, in the early days of production, Howard was being played by a puppet. But George Lucas saw the footage and decided he wanted Howard to look more realistic. So he commissioned that $2 million duck suit, stuck Ed Gale in it, and what we got was, in my opinion, one of the best animatronic puppet suits in the history of cinema, even surpassing, in my view, what we got nearly a decade later with the sitcom Dinosaurs. Unfortunately, what it effectively did was feed into people's false notion of the uncanny valley, which effectively just means that it looked too close to real without actually being real, and that it should have somehow looked more like an animation. But just saying the uncanny valley is not a substantive criticism. It's just a matter of preference. Your preference. Not everyone subscribes to the notion of the uncanny valley. I certainly do not. So if your argument is that the look of Howard is too disturbing, number one, how'd you feel about this?
Gross.
And number two, have you ever seen Frank Brunner's artwork on Howard the Duck? Are you going to tell me that that wasn't intended to be disturbing? In actuality, what the film effectively did was it captured the essence of Steve Gerber and Frank Brunner's Howard and brought him to life on the big screen. Now, I imagine there were plenty of people in the 1970s who were turned off by the cigar-smoking talking duck of the comics, so naturally the same ought to be true of that character on the big screen. So I would argue that the filmmakers actually did a good job being faithful to the source material by having a Howard that was too disturbing for some viewers to even look at. Now, the last point I want to make about Howard the Duck is that it has some of the best world building you're ever going to find. Now, when the film opens up, we're looking at a body of water with a city reflected on it. And as we pan up, you see the two moons in the sky, which tells us we are on a world unlike our own. But the moons are floating over what looks very much like a US city. So we're on a world not like our own, that is similar to our own. And this continues as Howard goes into his living room. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of people have some unfounded criticisms. They say that, oh, the duck puns in the living room are just too cringy. But what's happening there is that you are unfortunately missing the point because you're too jaded towards this film. You don't have a problem with those same duck puns when they exist in DuckTales or in Darkwing Duck, but you do have a problem with duck puns when they exist in Howard the Duck. And you're missing the point of what they're effectively doing and doing really well. And that's taking easily recognizable imagery like pop culture references. For example, Rolling Egg Magazine, Raiders of the Lost Stork, Splash Dance. These are things that you immediately recognize to their counterparts in our world. So it's setting up the notion that we are in a place that's not our own, but is similar to our own. It's marrying the worlds of the familiar with the unfamiliar. And that scene's doing a really good job of that, because it's getting you used to the idea that this is a world similar to our own, but populated entirely by ducks. And where they do an excellent job of this is when Howard sits down and starts flipping through the channels. Because it's just like channel surfing in our world. You'll see the same types of things.
Jock itch again? I've got just the thing. Here, why not take a shot of new Shorts Blaster? It's guaranteed to wipe out feather fungus in even the most active crotches.
Shorts Blaster.
In addition, you won a new car! But that's not all!
Oh, Fred, I love you so much. It hurts. Like Cancer Society.
$79.95? Forget it! $49.99? No way! I'm Crazy Webby, and my prices are insane!
All of these types of things that are similar to what we would witness if we were flipping through the channels in our world, but with ducks. So it quickly establishes a world populated by ducks that is very much like the world that we presently live in. And it needs to do this quickly because moments later, Howard's then dragged down to Earth. And the filmmakers once again have to do some excellent world building, but now through the eyes of an alien. And this is where they nail it. Because now that we're used to the world of Duck World, seeing the 80s Cleveland, and first seeing it through these 80s punks makes it feel like we're in a foreign world and we're foreigners to this strange place with these strange creatures. And the film does a really good job there with its dual world building, and it's unfortunate that that's something that it just won't ever get the proper credit for. Now, to wrap this up, I just want to say that yeah, Howard the Duck is flawed. But you know what? Star Wars was flawed. The Avengers was flawed. The Lord of the Rings, flawless. Shut your mouth. But just like the Avengers, and just like Star Wars, there are things about those movies that outweigh the flaws. We don't define Star Wars or the Avengers by its flaws. We define it by the things that are great about those films. And I think that's the same of Howard the Duck. I think if you can look past its flaws, you can see that there's a lot of great stuff there. It's got great world building. It's got some excellent special effects for the time. It's got some excellent character work. Its absurdity is actually laugh out loud hilarious. And I think if you can go into it and look at it with an open mind, you can find those things. And you can look past its flaws. So all I'm asking is that if you've never seen the film before, check it out. And do so with an open mind. If you have seen the film before, and you already know you hate it, maybe give it another shot. With everything we just talked about here, see if you don't change your mind. Because I would argue that the film holds up. And I think it can easily stand alongside some of the current Marvel movies. Now, it's no Infinity War. It's no Black Panther. It's no Guardians of the Galaxy. But is it better than Thor? Is it better than Iron Man 3? The Incredible Hulk? Yeah, I think so. So, remember, this was Marvel's first foray into the cinematic universe. So why not check it out and see if you don't come away with a different opinion. See if you don't change your mind towards it. So check it out. Let me know what you think. Well, there you have it. You ain't gonna find another substantive review of Howard the Duck like that anywhere on the internet. So if you liked what you saw, feel free to throw me a like. And if you're looking for reviews or in-depth analysis of some of the more offbeat movies or video games or comics, click here to subscribe. And remember to ring the bell so you can stay notified of future videos. And I will catch you on the next one. Peace.